The wind on Mount Hooker doesn't whisper, it howls. It tears through the high granite walls like an uninvited guest, rattling tents and gnawing at every loose strap and buckle. On that late summer morning in Wyoming's Wind River Range, the mountain looked almost serene from a distance. But anyone who's been there knows the truth. Mount Hooker isn't gentle, it isn't forgiving, and once you're up there, far from cell towers, far from easy rescue, you're on your own. Garrett Beckwith knew that better than most. At 47, he wasn't just another weekend climber with a shiny new harness. He was the guy people called when the route looked impossible. Years of technical ascents, unpredictable weather, and wilderness navigation had forged a quiet confidence in him. But this climb wasn't just about pushing himself. It was about sharing the summit with someone who meant more to him than any mountain ever could, his daughter Della. At 19, Della Beckwith was in that golden space between youth and adulthood. She'd grown up watching her dad disappear for days at a time into the mountains, coming back with sunburned cheeks, rope, guard hands, and stories that made her eyes widen. She didn't just want to hear those stories anymore. She wanted to live them, and Mount Hooker, with its sheer 1,800-foot vertical wall, was the perfect test. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also beautiful, secluded, and known for its multi-day climbs that tested even seasoned pros. They prepared like professionals: ropes, cams, harnesses, helmets, food for more than a week, a sturdy hanging portailage for overnight bivouacs, and enough layers to fight off the freezing alpine nights. They even packed extra gear for emergencies. But there was one thing they didn't bring, or rather, one thing they left behind: their satellite phones, both of them, sat quietly in the glove compartment of Garrett's truck in the trail head parking lot. No one thought much of it at the time. Garrett had always been good about sticking to his planned routes. They'd check in when they were back down, like always, but 3 days later, when that check-in never came, the people who loved them started to feel the first prickle of worry. By the 4th day, worry had hardened into fear, and by the end of the week, the search for Garrett and Della Beckwith was the biggest rescue operation the Wind River Range had seen in years. Rescuers scoured the face of Mount Hooker from helicopters. They shouted their names across valleys and into granite corridors that swallowed the echoes. They checked every likely route, every possible campsite, every place where a misstep could turn deadly. But there was nothing. No gear, no rope, no footprints in the snow. It was as if the mountain had simply taken them. Days turned into weeks. The search officially ended, but the questions didn't. Friends speculated about storms or rockfall. Others whispered about a wrong turn, a fatal slip. Garrett's climbing partners insisted he was too careful for that. And then there were the theories, far-fetched ideas that maybe they'd left on purpose, that maybe the mountain wasn't the real danger after all. But without any trace, there was no way to know. Years passed, 11 of them to be exact. The Beckwith family learned to live with the ache of not knowing. Garrett's wife, Della's mom, kept their photos in the hallway, dusted but untouched. Friends stopped asking questions out loud, but they still thought about them when they passed Mount Hooker on the horizon. And then, in late summer of 2023, 2 climbers on an ambitious route made a discovery that would change everything. High up on a sheer cliff, wedged into a narrow ledge no wider than a kitchen table, they spotted something unnatural: faded fabric flapping gently in the wind. A closer look revealed an entire portailage camp, still anchored into the wall. Ropes hung stiff and sun-bleached, metal carabiners dulled with age. It was a frozen moment in time, untouched since the day it had been left. Inside the camp, they found supplies: food still sealed in pouches, a stove, climbing gear that had seen only light use. But in one of the 2 sleeping bags was something that made both men stop breathing for a moment. They didn't say much after that. They just took a GPS pin, snapped a few photos, and began the long, careful descent to the ranger station. The news spread faster than it had back in 2012, when Garrett and Della disappeared. Reporters called it a break in Wyoming's most baffling mountain mystery. Investigators called it a starting point. But no one could answer the most important question. Why was only one sleeping bag occupied? And where was the other person who had been in that camp? The mountain had kept its secret for more than a decade. And now, with just one haunting clue, it was about to tell a new chapter in a story no one thought would ever continue. The ranger who first saw the climbers walk in said later that he knew, just from their faces, that something was different. They weren't exhausted in the usual way climbers are after a hard route. They were pale, hollow-eyed, carrying something heavier than their packs. When they laid the photos down on the counter, the room went still. A grainy image of a faded red portalage. Another of ropes frozen stiff in a coiled tangle. And then the one photo no one spoke about, except to say it would need to go to the authorities immediately. It was strange because for years, everyone had imagined what happened to Garrett and Della. But now, with that single discovery, the imagining became something else, something heavier, more real. The mountain had finally given a sign, but it wasn't one that offered comfort. Back in 2012, the week before they left for Mount Hooker, Garrett was restless in that way experienced climbers get before a big route. He tripled, checked their gear, then checked it again. He pored over topographical maps spread across the kitchen table, tracing possible lines with his finger while Della sat beside him, sipping coffee and scribbling in a little spiral notebook. She was making a list of meals to bring, calculating weight, asking about where they'd refill water. It wasn't her first time on a serious climb. Garrett had taken her up shorter routes since she was 15. But this one was different, longer, more isolated. A place where even a twisted ankle could turn dangerous fast. She was nervous but not scared. "If you can do it, I can do it," she'd told him with a grin, and Garrett had smiled back, proud but protective. They'd talked about the weather patterns in late summer, about the kind of storms that can roll in with no warning in the Wind River Range, about how to read the clouds for signs. She was learning not just the mechanics of climbing, but the language of the mountains, the way they speak to those who listen. Mount Hooker wasn't just another peak. Its sheer west face, 1,800 feet of near-vertical granite, had drawn climbers from all over the world. It wasn't just tall, it was committing. Once you were halfway up, there was no easy retreat. You had to keep going. That was part of the draw for Garrett. It required strategy, patience, and trust between partners. And climbing with your daughter meant that trust was already built into every knot and anchor. The morning they left, the trailhead parking lot was quiet. A few other cars were there, dust settling on their windshields. Garrett parked near the edge, and as they unloaded packs, he set the satellite phones in the glove compartment, meaning to grab them after rearranging gear. But when the final adjustments were made, when the shoulder straps were snug and the waist belts clipped, the phones stayed behind. It wasn't a deliberate choice, just a small oversight. One of those little moments that seem meaningless until later, when you replay them in your mind over and over, wondering how much they mattered. The hike into Mount Hooker isn't short. It winds through meadows dotted with wildflowers, across streams where the water is so clear you can see every stone on the bottom, and then up into alpine country where the trees thin and the air sharpens. They took their time that first day, moving steadily but not rushing. Garrett pointed out landmarks, rock spires, glacial cirques, while Della took photos with the small camera slung over her shoulder. She wanted to document everything, not just for herself, but for her mom back home, so she can see where we were. She'd said that was the last anyone saw of them. The first few days after they missed their check-in were filled with a kind of optimistic urgency. Search and rescue teams worked long hours, convinced they'd find them delayed but alive. Helicopters scanned the cliffs. Spotters peered through binoculars from every angle. Experienced climbers volunteered to rappel into tricky sections, hoping to catch a glimpse of a tent, a rope, anything. But the mountain gave nothing back. It was frustrating for the rescuers because Mount Hooker isn't the kind of place you can just wander off, trail and get lost. The routes are few and well mapped. If something happened, it had to have been quick, decisive, and in a place difficult to see. Without a signal from a phone or locator beacon, the search was like looking for a shadow in a thunderstorm. The Beckwith family came to the search site in those early days, setting up a base near the trailhead. Della's mom, Laura, kept a photo of the two of them clipped to her jacket. It showed Garrett with one arm around Della's shoulders, both of them grinning in the sunlight, ropes coiled across their backs. Volunteers who came in from the field would see her there and redouble their efforts, but as the days stretched on, the mood began to shift. Rescue became recovery. Hope began to thin. By the third week, the official search was scaled back. A few close friends of Garrett's stayed behind, unwilling to quit, but eventually even they had to leave. The Wind River Range moved on with the seasons. Snow came, ice sealed the ledges. And the story of the missing father and daughter became one of those mountain mysteries that locals would mention with a shake of the head, until the summer of 2023. The two climbers who found the camp had been aiming for a new variation on an established route, something challenging, a little off the beaten path. They weren't looking for history. But the moment they saw the flash of unnatural color on the ledge, they knew it wasn't just abandoned gear from a recent climb. The weathering, the sun-bleached fabric, it all spoke of years in place. And the way the camp was set, it hadn't been stripped or looted. Everything was still there, as if its occupants had just stepped away for a moment. The authorities who hiked in to examine it later described a strange stillness around the site. The ledge was small, just big enough for the portage and a few gear bags. There was no sign of a rockfall or storm damage. The ropes were anchored solidly into the wall, as if whoever tied them knew they'd be relying on them. And yet, only one sleeping bag held what appeared to be human remains. The other was zipped open and empty. Theories started almost immediately. Some said maybe one of them had fallen and the other stayed behind. Others thought maybe something forced one of them to leave the camp and try to get down alone. But there were no signs of a struggle, no scattered gear, no obvious path leading away. Just that one occupied sleeping bag, silent in the wind. Back in town, word spread fast. Reporters wanted to know if this meant the case was finally solved. But investigators were careful with their answers. Finding the camp was a breakthrough, yes, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Why was it hidden from view for so long? How had searchers missed it back in 2012? And most haunting of all, where was the other person who had been there? For Laura Beckwith, the discovery reopened wounds that had never really closed. She'd spent 11 years learning how to live with absence, with the heavy knot, knowing. Now she had a piece of the puzzle, but not enough to see the whole picture. She spoke briefly to reporters, saying only that she hoped the discovery would lead to answers and that she still believed in finding the truth. The investigation quietly expanded. Rangers revisited old maps, marking areas that hadn't been searched thoroughly the first time. Climbers who'd been on the mountain in the summer of 2012 were contacted again, asked if they'd noticed anything strange. But as weeks went by, no new leads surfaced. The camp on the cliff remained a silent witness, unwilling, or unable, to explain what had happened there. Mount Hooker stood as it always had, wind carving at its face, snow settling in the cracks. The mountain doesn't remember the way people do. It keeps its own counsel, and for now, it was keeping this secret still. When word of the discovery reached the climbing community, it was like a ripple running through cold water. People who hadn't spoken of Garrett and Della in years suddenly found themselves remembering where they were when they first heard they'd gone missing. Some recalled conversations with Garrett in dusty gear shops, where he'd quietly advise younger climbers about rope systems or weather windows. Others remembered seeing Della's name pop up on local climbing forums, asking questions about gear weight or bivy setups. Now those memories were wrapped in a new layer of unease, because it was no longer just a mystery. It was a mystery with something tangible, and that made it real again. The Wind River Range has its share of legends. Climbers swap stories about storms that come out of nowhere, about routes where you can feel the air change before the clouds roll in. But the Beckwith disappearance had always stood apart, partly because of who they were and partly because of the sheer absence of clues. Even among seasoned mountaineers, there was a quiet understanding. Mountains don't give up secrets unless they choose to, and when they do, it's never the whole truth, just enough to keep you wondering. Investigators decided to focus on reconstructing those missing days in 2012. They went back through old weather records, searching for patterns that might explain a forced delay on the wall. They reviewed the photos taken by hikers who were in the area that summer, scanning for tiny details in the backgrounds, faint smudges on a cliff face, the shape of a portage half a mile away. They even spoke to pilots who'd flown in the search helicopters, asking if any of them had seen signs of a camp in that sector. Every answer seemed to lead nowhere, but one ranger, a man named Jim Hartley, couldn't let it go. He'd been in the initial search team and had walked those meadows, shouting their names into the wind until his voice was hoarse. He still remembered the first night they'd camped below Mount Hooker during the search. The air had dropped to freezing, and the cliffs had glowed silver under the moonlight. He'd thought then about the two of them, somewhere up there, maybe fighting the same cold. That thought had kept him moving for days. Now, years later, he felt the same pull to go back, but this time he wanted to approach the mountain differently. Meanwhile, in town, Laura Beckwith found herself caught between hope and dread. The discovery meant there might be answers coming, but answers could also mean endings. For years, she'd built a fragile routine around not knowing. She still checked the trail, headlogs sometimes half, hoping to see her husband's handwriting, even though she knew it was impossible. Now she spent nights replaying the moment Garrett told her about the trip. He'd kissed her cheek, told her they'd be careful, that they'd check in like always. She remembered laughing and saying, "You always say that." The memory hurt now because the truth was he had meant it. The climbing world began to speculate. Some said the ledge's position meant it was part of a lesser, known variation of the main west face route, a tricky line that avoided some of the most exposed pitches but added complex traverses. If Garrett had chosen it, maybe it was to make the climb safer for Della. But others disagreed, saying Garrett was too experienced to take an untested route without more prep. The debate spilled over into forums and social media threads, each theory dissected, each detail examined until it felt worn thin. But the strangest part was how the camp had stayed hidden for so long. From the air, it should have been visible. The ledge wasn't deep enough to conceal the portage completely, and the bright color of the fabric, even faded, should have stood out against the pale granite. Some suggested maybe the camp had been set up after the initial search window, meaning they'd been alive longer than anyone realized. Others wondered if weather conditions in 2012, snow, fog, glare, had simply masked it from view. Neither explanation sat comfortably with those who knew the mountain well. Jim Hartley decided to visit the site himself before winter closed in. He hiked in alone, moving quietly through terrain he knew like the back of his hand. The closer he got to the base of the cliff, the more he felt that familiar stillness. Mountains have a way of making you feel observed, though you know logically that's impossible. When he finally craned his neck to see the ledge high above, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It was there exactly as the photos showed, unmoving, waiting. Climbers who'd been part of the discovery had described the remains in the sleeping bag only in careful, measured words, enough to confirm what it was, but not enough to paint a full picture. For Jim, that lack of detail gnawed at him. He knew it was partly out of respect, partly to avoid speculation, but in a case like this, speculation was inevitable. His own mind filled the gaps with a dozen possibilities, none of them good. Back in town, a parallel subplot was taking shape. A young journalist named Maya Darnell had taken an interest in the story, not just because of the mystery, but because she'd grown up hearing about the Beckwiths. Her father had climbed with Garrett years earlier, and she remembered Della teaching her how to tie basic knots at a picnic when they were both little. For Maya, this wasn't just a news story, it was personal. She began digging into archives, interviewing old climbing partners, piecing together a timeline of Garrett's final months before the trip. She discovered he'd been unusually quiet that summer, canceling a couple of climbs he'd planned with friends. No one thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed worth noting. Meyer also found something else, a map in Garrett's handwriting, tucked into the back of a guidebook one of his friends had kept. It wasn't the standard west-face topo. It had faint pencil lines tracing a different approach, one that curved around the side of the mountain before joining the main wall. If Garrett had been planning to take that path, it might explain why searchers had missed them. But it also raised another question. Why hadn't he mentioned this variation to anyone before leaving? Each new detail seemed to split the story in two directions. On one hand, there was the possibility that this was simply a tragic climbing accident, hidden by the mountain's scale and weather. On the other, there was the creeping sense that something about the trip had been different from the start, that Garrett might have chosen a path no one else knew about for reasons only he understood. The deeper everyone looked, the more the unanswered questions multiplied. Why had only one sleeping bag been occupied? Why had there been no sign of a descent attempt from the ledge? And why, after all these years, had the mountain decided to reveal the camp now? The search for truth was far from over, but the mountain still wasn't talking. Snow had started to dust the higher slopes of the Wind River Range by the time Jim Hartley made his second trip toward Mount Hooker. The air was sharper now, the kind that steals your breath in quick, white clouds. He moved with quiet purpose, knowing this might be the last chance before winter sealed the ledge under ice for another year. The closer he got, the more the wind seemed to rise, threading through the granite like an old voice trying to speak. He wasn't alone this time. Maya Darnell had convinced him to let her come. She carried only the essentials, a small pack, climbing helmet, notepad sealed in a plastic bag. Her camera hung from a strap across her chest, ready. She'd been following the story for months, piecing together scraps, but now she wanted to see the camp for herself. Jim had warned her it wouldn't be easy to look at. She'd only nodded. "I need to," she'd said. The climb to the base took hours. The ledge was far above, just a faint smudge of faded fabric against the endless rock. Even from the ground, it felt wrongsome, how too still, too self-contained, like a memory preserved in amber. The ropes dangling from it swayed just slightly in the wind, creaking against the anchors. As they set up to ascend, Maya kept glancing upward. She thought about Garrett and Della here, 11 years ago, hauling their gear, settling in for the night. She tried to imagine the view from up there, the sweep of peaks, the blue distance. But all she could see in her mind was the empty sleeping bag. Halfway up, the air grew colder. The sun had shifted behind thin clouds, casting the wall in a dim, flat light. Jim kept his voice low as he called out anchor checks, the sound muffled by the wind. They moved carefully, aware that the years had not been kind to the rock in this section. One wrong hold could send loose fragments tumbling into the void below. When they finally reached the ledge, Maya felt her stomach tighten. The portailage was exactly as in the photos. Faded red fabric stretched over the frame, corners frayed. Gear was still clipped to the wall. A stove, a few battered carabiners, food packets stiff with age. Dust and fine grit had settled in the creases, carried by the wind over the years. The sleeping bags lay side by side, one zipped tight, its shape unmistakable, the other gaped open, empty, the fabric rippling faintly. Jim crouched beside them, scanning the anchors and rope placements. This was solid, he murmured. He knew what he was doing. Maya moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything. Her fingers brushed the edge of the empty sleeping bag, and she felt the cold through her gloves. It wasn't just the mountain cold, it was the kind that came from something unfinished, something that didn't belong. She glanced at Jim. If one of them left, why didn't they take gear? Why not at least the rope? Jim shook his head. That's the question. They documented everything. Maya took close shots of the gear layout, the way the ropes were coiled, the position of each anchor. The more she saw, the more it unsettled her. Nothing looked rushed or abandoned in panic. It looked, paused, as if whoever had left intended to come back. By the time they began their descent, the light was fading. The wind carried a low whistle through the cracks, and Maya felt it following her all the way down, like the mountain was listening. Back in town, the sheriff's office received their photos and notes. The evidence would be analyzed, compared against the 2012 search records, but Jim had the sense that answers wouldn't come from a lab. They'd come from the mountain itself, if at all. The news of their visit spread quickly. Climbing forums lit up with theories. Some insisted the second person must have tried to descend for help, only to vanish somewhere below. Others argued they'd gone higher, attempting to escape bad weather that never showed on records. A few voices whispered darker possibilities, choices made in desperation, when the mountain strips away everything but survival. Laura Beckwith heard the speculation too. She didn't read the forums, but people brought it to her in careful, hesitant conversations. She listened without responding, her mind drifting back to the last night she'd spoken to them by phone. Garrett's calm voice saying everything was going to plan, Della laughing in the background. Those sounds felt impossibly far away now. Maya kept digging. The map she'd found in Garrett's handwriting weighed on her mind. It showed a traverse line that skirted a section of the wall most climbers avoided. When she overlaid it with the ledge's location, they matched almost perfectly. Garrett had meant to be there, but why that ledge, and why had no one ever mentioned it before? One night, she pulled an old interview with a local climber who'd been on the mountain during the 2012 search. He'd mentioned seeing something red on the wall, but dismissed it as gear left from another party years earlier. The detail had been buried in a longer conversation and never followed up. Now it gnawed at her. Had the camp been visible all along, overlooked in the chaos of the search? As autumn deepened, Jim and Maya began planning a return, not just to the ledge, but higher up, tracing the possible routes Garrett might have taken from there. It would be dangerous, especially with winter approaching, but both felt the same pull. They weren't chasing closure yet. They were chasing understanding. The night before they set out, the forecast shifted. A cold front was coming, bringing high winds and early snow. Waiting would mean postponing until next year. Going now meant risking being caught on the wall when the storm hit. Jim hesitated, weighing the choice. Maya didn't. If we wait, she said quietly, the mountain will just keep its secret. The next morning, they left before dawn, headlamps cutting narrow tunnels of light through the dark. The air smelled of snow, even though the sky was still clear. As they approached the base, Jim felt that old stillness again. He'd learned to recognize it not as peace, but as the moment before something breaks. Above them, the ledge waited. And somewhere beyond it, higher, deeper into the wall, was whatever truth the mountain had been holding for 11 long years. They started the climb, and the wind began to rise. The first few pitches were slow. Jim and Maya moved in steady silence, their focus locked on the cold granite in front of them. The wind that had been just a whisper at the base was now threading through cracks, catching loose grains of rock and carrying them down in faint rattles. The cliff face rose above them like an endless wall, featureless except for narrow seams and ledges that seemed too far apart to be useful. By the time they reached the old camp, the sky had dimmed with a thin, metallic haze. The air tasted of snow. Jim checked the anchors again out of habit, his hands moving over the metal in practiced motions. Maya, meanwhile, scanned the wall above, trying to picture what Garrett might have seen that last day. Her breath fogged in the cold, vanishing into the wind. They didn't linger. The goal wasn't the camp this time. It was what lay beyond it. Jim clipped in, tested his weight on the next line, and began to lead them higher. The rock here felt different, weather worn in some places, strangely clean in others, as though sections had been wiped smooth more recently than a decade of storms could account for. He made a mental note but kept climbing. 2 pitches above the ledge, they reached a narrow traverse, barely a foot wide, skirting a sharp drop that disappeared into shadow. Here, the wind was sharper, cutting through their layers. As they inched along, Maya noticed something on the rock, faint scrapes in the granite, not from natural erosion but from metal edges, climbing gear. The marks led forward, but they didn't match the usual flow of movement. They looked hesitant, doubled back in places, as if someone had changed their mind mid-route. They followed the line until it ended at a small alcove, shielded from the worst of the wind. The space was barely big enough for 2 people to crouch inside, but it was sheltered. And there, wedged in a crack of stone, was something that stopped both of them cold, a climbing shoe. It was faded, the rubber hardened with age, but the laces were still intact. Inside, packed deep into the toe, was a strip of folded paper. Maya's hands shook as she eased it out, the brittle fibers crackling in the cold. She looked at Jim before unfolding it. The note was short. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still legible. Wait here. I'll come back. Maya's breath caught. There was no name, no date, nothing to say who had written it, but it was enough to shatter their assumptions. If one of them had left the ledge willingly, leaving the other behind, then something had happened between this alcove and the camp that no one had accounted for. The wind rose again, rattling the paper in her hands. Jim took it carefully, sliding it into a waterproof pouch. This changes everything, he said quietly. They started searching the alcove more carefully. In a narrow crack behind a loose stone, Maya found a small, weathered pouch clipped to an ancient piece of cord. Inside was a handful of energy gels, a half-used roll of medical tape, and a rusted multi-tool. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Someone had stopped here, stashed supplies, maybe planning to return. But return from where? The air temperature dropped sharply, pulling them back to the present. The storm was moving in faster than the forecast had predicted. They couldn't linger much longer. Still, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing in the middle of the story's missing chapter. As they packed up, Maya caught movement high on the wall above. A flash of faded fabric in a narrow seam, just far enough away to be unreachable without a major detour. It was there for a moment, then whipped flat by the wind. She pointed it out, and Jim stared for a long time. Could be debris, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. They began their descent, the wind now pushing against them with sudden bursts. The storm was only hours away, the sky darkening in fast, moving streaks. But the note burned in Maya's mind. Wait here, I'll come back. If one of them had made it that far from the camp, maybe the mountain hadn't taken them both at once. Maybe the truth was scattered across these ledges and alcoves, waiting for someone stubborn enough to piece it together. And somewhere up there, beyond the reach of their ropes, something else was still clinging to the rock, waiting to be found. The wind was screaming by the time Jim and Maya reached the base again. Snowflakes spun in the air, thin and sharp, carried on gusts that made it hard to stand. They could have left the mountain then, taken the note and the shoe back to town, let the winter swallow the rest until spring. But the flash of fabric Maya had seen higher up wouldn't leave either of their minds. It wasn't just curiosity. It felt like the last piece. They didn't speak much as they set new lines, pushing upward into the worsening weather. The granite was slick in places, the cold biting through their gloves. Every move took focus, and every gust threatened to unbalance them. But they kept climbing, driven by the feeling that they were close to where Garrett's and Della's final hours had played out. When they reached the seam where Maya had spotted the fabric, they saw it wasn't debris at all. It was a jacket, faded orange, wedged deep in the rock. The zipper was half open, and inside one pocket was a small weatherproof notebook. Jim's fingers trembled as he unzipped it and handed it to Maya. The first page held Garrett's handwriting. The entries were dated from the days after they'd missed their check-in in 2012. At first, they read like a climbing log: weather notes, gear checks, ration counts. Then the tone shifted. One entry read, "Della hurt her leg on the traverse, can't descend in this weather, trying to keep her warm." Another, "Left her in the portalage to scout for a better descent, will come back for her." The last entry was short: "Storm worse than expected, found shelter here, tried to get back but ledge unreachable, rope damaged, waiting for break." There were no more words after that. Maya closed the notebook slowly. The truth was simple and brutal. Garrett had gone to find a safer route, planning to return, but the storm had cut him off. He'd been trapped in this seam, unable to reach his daughter, just as she had been trapped in the ledge below. Jim searched the narrow space and found what was left of him. Time and weather had reduced it to little more than fragments of gear and bone, tucked into the sheltered crack. It was enough to confirm what they already knew. Garrett hadn't abandoned her. He'd tried to save her and paid for it with his life. They sat there for a moment in the howl of the wind, the story heavy in their chests. It wasn't the ending they'd hoped for, but it was an ending. They had found them both, and they could finally tell the truth. The storm pressed harder, forcing them to pack the notebook and descend before the mountain decided to keep them too. Snow stung their faces, ropes stiffening in the cold. The descent was slow and tense, each anchor point checked twice, each step deliberate. When they reached the base, the sky was a solid wall of white. Maya looked up one last time, the ledge and the seam already fading into the storm. It felt like the mountain was closing over the story again, letting them take only what they'd earned. Back in town, they handed the notebook to the authorities, who confirmed the handwriting and the dates. Laura Beckwith wept quietly when she read the entries, her hand resting on the page where Garrett had written Della's name. It could have ended there, but a week later, when Maya went through her photos from the climb, she noticed something. In one shot of the alcove where they'd found the shoe, there was a faint shadow in the corner, not gear, not rock. A small, carved mark in the granite. She zoomed in. It was the outline of two initials, DB. They'd assumed Della had stayed in the ledge until the end, but now Maya wasn't so sure. The mountain might have told them Garrett's fate, but for Della, it seemed, the story wasn't finished after all. The photo stayed open on Maya's laptop for a long time. She kept zooming in and out, as though the faint carving might somehow reveal more if she stared long enough. The initials were small, barely an inch high, but they were deliberate. You could see the careful strokes, the way the lines crossed at perfect angles. It wasn't just idle scratching with a crampon tip. It was a mark someone wanted found. Jim sat across the table, watching her. Could have been anyone, he said at first, but his voice lacked conviction. Climbers mark things all the time. Not there, Maya said. That alcove was buried under snow most years. It's not a resting spot. It's a shelter, and if she carved it, that means she made it off the ledge. The possibility cracked open a whole new layer of questions. The notebook had given Garrett's side of the story, but this tiny carving suggested Della's didn't end the way everyone believed. If she had gotten down from the ledge, even partway, what happened after? Why wasn't she found during the original search? Maya sent the image to the search coordinator from back in 2012, a man named Earl Timmons who still lived near Dubois. He called her the next morning, his voice low and careful. "That alcove wasn't on our search grid. Too dangerous to reach in those conditions. We swept the main face, the ridges, but not there. He paused, then added, if she made it that far, she might have been looking for him, for Garrett. The thought settled heavy in Maya's chest. She imagined Della, 19, hurt, exhausted, hauling herself out of the portalage in the teeth of a storm, following her father's path. The carving could have been a way to mark that she'd been there, a breadcrumb in case someone came looking. The urge to go back was immediate. Jim hesitated, but in the end, the pull of unfinished answers was stronger than common sense. They waited for a break in the weather, packed lighter this time, and went straight for the alcove. Reaching it in summer was easier than their first climb in winter, but the moment they got there, the air felt different, still, cold, like the place held its own pocket of time. The carving was real, no question. And next to it, half hidden in a crack in the rock, was something Maya hadn't noticed in the photo, a small, weatherproof tin. Her hands shook as she pried it free. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, the writing faint from age but still readable. It was Della's handwriting. Dad, if you find this, I'm heading down. You said the snow cave by the lower buttress would be safe. I'll wait there. It was dated the day after Garrett's last notebook entry. They didn't speak for a long moment. The lower buttress was far below, on a route that would have been nearly invisible from the air during the original searches. If she'd made it that far, there was a chance she'd survived for days, maybe longer. They descended carefully, following what might have been her route. The snow cave was still there, a hollow in the ice and rock, partially collapsed. Inside, they found the remnants of an emergency blanket, a small pile of stones arranged in a circle. Maybe a candle holder, maybe just something to pass the time. And there, tucked under the collapsed wall, was Della's pack. The contents were heartbreaking in their simplicity. An empty thermos, a granola bar wrapper, a photo of her and Garrett taken at the trailhead. No remains, no clear sign of what had finally happened to her. It was possible she'd tried to move again and been lost in one of the countless crevices or gullies below. They brought the pack back down, and the authorities combed the area for days. Nothing else surfaced. But the discovery changed everything. Della hadn't simply waited for rescue. She'd fought to survive, made her own choices, tried to reach safety. When Maya and Jim returned to town, they gave the pack to Laura Beckwith. She held it like it was something alive, her fingers brushing over the straps. She was just like him. She whispered, always moving forward. The final report pieced together a story no one had fully known. Garrett had gone for help, been trapped. Della had climbed down to find him, missed him, left him a note, and made it to the lower buttress before the mountain claimed her too. There was no way to know exactly how her last hours had gone, but there was comfort in knowing she hadn't simply vanished into mystery. She had left a trail, signs of her will to survive. In the weeks after, Maya found herself thinking about how mountains keep their secrets. Sometimes they give back pieces, but never all at once. The Beckwith story had taken over a decade to surface, and even now, parts of it would remain in shadow. The climbing community in Wyoming held a memorial at the base of Mount Hooker. Climbers from all over came to share stories, some about Garrett's skill and generosity, others about the quiet determination Della had shown on earlier climbs. Laura spoke last, standing with the notebook in one hand and her daughter's pack in the other. "They didn't make it home," she said, "but they didn't give up either. That's the part I want people to remember." After the crowd dispersed, Maya and Jim hiked back to the first ledge where the portalage had hung all those years. They left a small plaque there, bolted into the rock. It read, "For Garrett and Della Beckwith, father and daughter forever climbing." The wind was calm that day, the sky clear. For the first time since the whole search began, Maya felt the mountain wasn't pushing them away. It was letting them go. Driving back toward Dubois, Jim glanced at her and said, "You think that's it, all the answers we're going to get?" Maya thought about the initials in the alcove, the note in the tin, the snow cave. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe the mountain still has more to say. We just might not be the ones to hear it. The truth was, the story had already given them more than they'd expected. They'd come looking for an ending and found a testament to endurance instead. In a way, that was the resolution. Not every question answered, but enough to understand the heart of it. Mount Hooker would keep standing, storms would keep sweeping its face, and somewhere up there, the traces of Garrett and Della's climb would fade into the rock. But for those who'd searched, and for those who'd loved them, the mountain would never just be another peak. It would be the place where a father and daughter fought side by side, where love outlasted even the fiercest storm. And that was a truth worth carrying, no matter how much time passed.